Hey, heads up, bitches. Welcome to another episode of Cut the Shit. I am Christian Tucker, giving you just another idiot's view of the world. I will be ranting and raving about this week's crap that has caught my attention for its stupidity or its uniqueness or its newsworthiness, or at least what I deem newsworthy anyways. As always, don't forget to catch us on the web at www.cuttheshitalready.com. There you will find links to hit to subscribe to our podcast. Also, you'll find a link to Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at PLZ Cut the Shit, as well as Facebook. You can go to www.facebook.com/Cut the Shit Already /. Got something good to say or pass along? Do it at any of these locations. Got some putrid shit to spew my direction? Do it there also, dirtbag. We welcome it all. Okay, so let's get this shit going, shall we? Well, hello, and welcome to episode 19 of Cut the Shit. Thanks for joining us. Let's get into it, shall we? We're going to end up talking a little about immigration, and it's going to be thanks to Matt Damon. So let's start off with laughable, but also good news. Matt Damon has truly, not some clickbait article, but honest to goodness, announced he is moving his family to Australia because of Trump's policies. Oh, you fucking snowflake little bitch. I hate the word snowflake. I don't even know where the fuck that came from. Forgive me. Anyways, finally, a Hollywood schmuck gonna back up the move out of the country bullshit. And I really can't think of a better person to lead the rats down that path. The Hollywood Pied Piper, if you will. But then, the next day, it came out that it's not permanent. Too fucking bad. You know, listen, Matt, don't let the door hit you in the ass, all right? Some source says it's for a year. Another source says it was only for 3 months. You know what? That's not even really worth reporting, then, is it? Why even bring it up if it's only for 3 months or even a fucking year? If it's just to do a movie, then don't try to hold some valued high ground in the eyes of your, elitist Hollywood puke friends by saying the move is because of Trump and his policies. Are you moving to Australia because of Trump and his policies, or are you moving there for a year to do a fucking movie? Which is it? You can't have it fucking both ways, pussy. More than likely, Damon, who has 4 children with his wife, may also be waiting for the controversy to die down after he had to publicly apologize for insensitive comments he made about the wave of sexual assault allegations shaking Hollywood. Which, by the way, I agreed with his assessment on the Hollywood epidemic known as Me Too, right? There is a difference between some guy grabbing an ass thinking he's being cute and Harvey Weinstein raping bitches. But that's neither here nor there. We've already kind of done an episode on that. So, moving right along. Want to know what is really funny? If he is moving because of Trump policies, then this jackass should have done his homework, if he truly hates Trump's policies, because Australia is more conservative and rigid with their policies than us. Just ask Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Remember the trouble they ran into when they tried sneaking their dogs into Australia and were basically held at gunpoint to give a PSA about why you shouldn't fucking do that shit? It's fucking insane. Australian immigration. Listen, it's a lot stricter than us. I'm going to read an article from The Atlantic by J. Weston Phippen. That's Phippen. Phippen, whatever. Anyways, April 1976 to 1981, over 2,000 Vietnamese migrants came to Australia looking to escape the problems in their home country. At the time, most Australians wanted to let these Vietnamese migrants stay in their country, so the newcomers were given refugee status. But that changed. The next wave of boat people came in 1989, and each year after, for 10 years, they floated to Australia, many from Cambodia. Unlike the decade before, the Australian government first detained these migrants. Then they processed them through the courts. The third major wave of boat people came from the Middle East, and by 2001, 3/4 of Australians, one of them turned away. They were done with these people floating to their fucking country, right? The country's policy today toward asylum seekers who arrive by sea is much different. So here we go. How is it different, you say? It places them in offshore detention facilities on 2 Pacific Island nations, Nauru and Papua New Guinea, right? For the sake of this article, they call it PNG, keep it short. And they process their asylum claims while keeping them there. Human rights advocates and refugee organizations say the country's policy is cruel. It sets no bail, it sets no time limit to their stay, and on average, asylum seekers will spend a year in the camps. Australia's immigration minister, Peter Dutton, responded by saying that their position is very clear, and that is we are not going to accept people who have sought to come to our country illegally by boat. They will not settle permanently in our country. That's about as harsh, or even harsher than what Trump says, okay, Matt Damon? In 2001, that Australia set itself apart, and one incident, the Tampa affair, as they called it, that brought its policy to the forefront. It was an election year in Australia, and Prime Minister John Howard's Liberal Party, which actually holds a conservative ideology, go figure, was trailing in the polls. But on the policy launch day of his election campaign, Howard made his stance on immigration clear. Quote, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come," unquote. His ideas on immigration shaded him a strong leader and is credited in part with his party's election victory that November. At the time, many migrants and refugees sailed and floated to Australia across the Indian Ocean to Christmas Island, an Australian territory about 1,200 miles from the mainland. But only a 3-day boat from Jakarta, Indonesia. So near the end of August 2001, 433 asylum seekers, mostly Afghans, lost their way at sea on a wooden fishing boat called the Palapa and sent a distress signal. They were picked up 2 days later by the MV Tampa, the Norwegian freightliner. What followed was a game of chicken. Typically, a captain will sell people rescued from the water to the nearest port that will have them. In this case, that would have been Christmas Island, the Australian territory where the refugees had wanted to go and where they could be processed for asylum in Australia. But Howard refused them entry. A port 12 hours away in Merak, Indonesia, would take the ship. But the asylum seekers were dehydrated and sick, and they included children and pregnant women. Some of those on board threatened suicide if returned, and the captain doubted whether his crew of 27 can make that far of a trip with the additional 433 passengers. So he sailed towards Christmas Island, and Howard then dispatched the military. As the deadlock became international news, Howard tried to pass a bill in Parliament that grants the government power to remove foreign ships from its waters. But he didn't get the votes. International media, human rights groups, and world leaders pressured Australia to do something. And after 8 days, Howard worked out a deal in which the Australian Navy would take the refugees to Nauru, a Pacific island nation, where they'd be kept in camps while they waited for the government to process their asylum applications. These offshore camps would become central to Howard's immigration policy called the Pacific Solution that Australia passed in 2001. So then in 2007, Australia had a change in government. The center-left Labour Party won the election, and Kevin Rudd, the new Prime Minister, kept his campaign promise to do away with the offshore processing camps. It would not last long. In 2009, 2 years later, 60 boats arrived in Australia with over 2,700 asylum seekers. The next year, it was 134 boats with 6,500 people, then 69 boats with 4,500 people. Rudd resisted critics, but soon found himself losing a party leadership vote to Julia Gillard, who succeeded him as the prime minister. And Julia, I apologize if your last name is Gillard. Gillard or Gillard. Not sure. I apologize, Julia. Under her government, in May of 2013, Australia excised even the mainland from its migration zone, which basically meant migrants could be sent to the offshore detention facilities wherever their ships landed. Until then, even under Howard's policies, those who reached the mainland Australia could not legally be sent to Nauru or the PNG. The asylum seekers now stay in the camps while their claims are processed, regardless of where they land at in Australia and its surrounding bodies of islands, okay? But even if they are found to have a valid asylum claims, as 90% of them are, they are not allowed to settle in Australia. Instead, they may be settled on Nauru or PNG. 4 even went to Cambodia, for which Australia paid the country about $42 million for 4 people to go to Cambodia. Fuck me. The camps remain contentious, and refugee groups say they violate human rights. How about this? Don't fucking go to a country illegally, and you won't have to worry about fucking human rights, period. In 2014, asylum seekers at the Ellis Island Detention Center protested, and security responded with violence, killing a 23-year-old Iranian. That same year, a former Associated Press reporter described the Ellis Island Center to the BBC like this. The refugees live in shipping containers. There's water everywhere. Lights aren't working. The heat is oppressive. There's no windows. There was a detainee with a bandage over his eye asking for help in his stinking hot compound. Women and children complain of sexual abuse, and recent numbers put the average stay at 450 days, though almost 1/4 of asylum seekers spend more than 2 years in the camps. And look at us. The United States, we just let people traipse across the borders with impunity. Compared to what's going on in Australia, we're fucking saints here in America. So yeah, bye-bye, Matt Damon. Go some fucking place because you don't like Trump's policies, if that is indeed the case, to a place that's even fucking harsher than us. You want some more examples of some good shit like that? All right. Representatives from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees toured the Nauru Center. An Iranian asylum seeker reportedly said, "This is how tired we are. This action will prove how exhausted we are. I cannot take it anymore." Then he lit himself on fire and died. A couple days later, while the guy is there, 5 more refugees attempted suicide. This sounds like fucking hell on earth, but the United States is fucking horrible for wanting to build a wall, right? Dutton, the Australian immigration minister, said if people think that through action or self-harm or harming a member of their family that is going to result in them coming to Australia and staying here permanently, that will not be the outcome. So basically he's like, hey, fuck you, catch yourself on fire, kill yourself, kill your fucking buddy sitting next to you, fucking kill your daughter. You ain't fucking coming. So that's some pretty harsh fucking shit. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull added, "We cannot be misty-eyed about this. We have to be very clear and determined in our national purpose. We must have secure borders, and we do, and we will, and they will remain so as long as I am the Prime Minister of this country." No wonder they don't have a bunch of fucking shooting deaths and shit over there, because they don't let motherfuckers just come roaming into their country who were not born and naturalized citizens there. Listen, we just want to build a wall, not detention camps with no representation and held people for 450 days at a time. Matt Damon, do you know any of this? You're a fucking idiot. Goodbye. So fuck it. I wasn't planning on doing this podcast on immigration, but why the fuck not? We're hip deep into it fucking already. So, we just spoke of Australia's intense immigration, a country some see as liberally leaning. Me, I've always wanted to visit, possibly like Matt Damon, live there for a year and then come home. But I wouldn't be leaving because of anybody's fucking policies. Even if Hillary Clinton was in office now, I wouldn't move there for a year because of her, all right? So let's discuss America and immigration. Not from the beginning of time that take too fucking long. Let's discuss immigration in the modern era, from the 1800s till now. Between 1850 and 1930, about 5 million Germans migrated to the United States, peaking between 1881 and 1885 when 1 million Germans settled primarily in the Midwest. Between 1820 and 1930, 3.5 million British and 4.5 million Irish entered America. Before 1845, most Irish immigrants were Protestants. After 1845, Irish Catholics began arriving in large numbers, largely driven by the Great Famine. After 1800, larger steam-powered ocean-going ships replaced sailing ships, which resulted in lower fares and greater immigrant mobility. Young people between the ages of 15 to 30 were predominant among the newcomers. This wave of migration, constituting the third episode in the history of U.S. immigration, may be better referred to as the flood of immigrants, as nearly 25 million Europeans made the long trip. Italians, Greeks, Hungarians, Poles, and other speaking Slavic languages made up the bulk of this migration. Part of that was 2.5 to 4 million Jews were among them as well. At this point, the United States realized things were getting out of fucking hand. Millions upon millions of people coming over to this country, right? So shortly after the U.S. Civil War, some states started to pass their own immigration laws, which then prompted the U.S. Supreme Court to rule in 1875 that immigration was a federal responsibility. In 1875, the nation passed its first immigration law, the Page Act of 1875, also known as the Asian Exclusion Act, outlawing the import of Asian contract laborers, any Asian women who would engage in prostitution, and all people considered to be convicts in their own countries. Great. We're not bringing people over for cheap labor, and we're not bringing over fucking criminals. Sounds like a fucking good idea. Didn't need to be regulated just Asia, in my opinion, but hey. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act by excluding all Chinese laborers from entering the country. The Chinese Exclusion Act severely curtailed the number of immigrants of Chinese descent allowed into the United States for a 10-year period. The law was renewed in 1892 and in 1902. During this period, Chinese migrants illegally entered the United States through the loosely guarded U.S.-Canadian border. Prior to 1890, the individual states, rather than the federal government, regulated immigration into the United States. Meaning Florida might have a different immigration policy than Georgia, right? Okay, you get it. So in 1954, Operation Wetback, I'm not fucking shitting you, Operation Wetback, forced the return of thousands of illegal immigrants to Mexico. Between 1944 and 1954, the decade of the wetback, the number of illegal immigrants coming from Mexico increased by 6,000%. It is estimated that before Operation Wetback got underway, more than 1 million workers had crossed the Rio Grande illegally. Cheap labor displaced native agricultural workers, and increased violation of labor laws and discrimination encouraged criminality, disease, and illiteracy. Try saying all those words real quick. That's not easy. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, back when Reagan was president, creating for the first time penalties for employers who hired illegal immigrants. IRCA, as proposed in Congress, was projected to give amnesty to about 1 million workers in the country illegally. In practice, amnesty for about 3 million immigrants already in the United States was granted. Most were from Mexico. Legal Mexican immigrant family numbers were 2,198,000 in 1980, 4,289,000 in 1990, that includes the IRCA, and 7,841,000 in 2000. Adding another 12 million illegal immigrants, of which about 80% are thought to be Mexicans, would bring the Mexican family total to over 16 million, or about 16% of the Mexican population residing here in the United States illegally. 16% of Mexico's population here illegally. So there's just a few facts on immigration and who immigrated here, right? So let's talk. Ellis Island. Ever hear of it? All right. Ellis Island in upper New York Bay was the gateway for over 12 million immigrants to the United States. The busiest immigrant inspection station was Ellis Island for over 60 years, 1892 to 1954. In the 35 years before Ellis Island opened, more than 8 million immigrants arriving in New York City had been processed by officials at Castle Garden Immigration Depot in Lower Manhattan. It was just across the bay. The federal government assumed control of immigration on April 18, 1890, and Congress appropriated $75,000 to construct America's first federal immigration station on Ellis Island. That's 1890. Between 1905 and 1914, an average of 1 million immigrants per year arrived in the United States. Immigration officials reviewed about 5,000 immigrants per day during the peak times at Ellis Island. Today, over 100 million Americans, about 1/3 or 40%, somewhere in that area, of our population in the United States can trace their ancestry to immigrants who arrived in America at Ellis Island before, dispersing to points all over the country. Generally, those immigrants who were approved spent from 2 to 5 hours at Ellis Island. That's not a long fucking time, right? Arrivals were asked 29 questions, including name, occupation, and the amount of money they carried. It was important to the American government that the new arrivals could support themselves and have money to get started. The average the government wanted the immigrants to have was between $18 and $25, which is about $600 in 2015 for adjusted inflation at the time of this article, apparently. Those with visible health problems or diseases were sent home, back to Ireland or England or Germany, or held in the island's hospital facilities for long periods of times. Some unskilled workers were rejected because they were considered likely to become a public charge. About 2% were detained, admission to the U.S., and sent back to their countries of origin for reasons such as having chronic contagious diseases, criminal backgrounds, or insanity. That sounds so fucking common sense. Somebody comes to our country and they're a fucking crazy person or have a background of criminal, past and diseases. Don't let them in. With the passing of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the number of immigrants being allowed in the United States declined greatly. The passing of the bill ended the era of mass immigration. After 1924, Ellis Island became primarily a detention and deportation processing station. Here's a funny one, surprised it took so long. Anarchists are denied admittance into the United States as of 1903. Wow. Also, a federal law is passed excluding persons with physical and mental disabilities, as well as children arriving without adults. A literacy test is introduced at this time and stays on the books until 1952. Why'd they ever fucking take it off? If you can't read or speak the language, what the fuck? Those over the age of 16 who cannot read 30 to 40 test words in their native language are no longer admitted through Ellis Island. Nearly all Asian immigrants are banned. So they weren't even asking them to speak English. We just want you to be able to read your own fucking language. If you can't read your own language, you're going to have a hell of a fucking time acclimating here. The Immigration Act of 1924 goes even further, limiting total annual immigration to 165,000 people and fixing quotas of immigrants from specific countries. Immigration into the United States continues mostly by land routes through Canada and Mexico. Illegal immigration becomes a constant source of political debate throughout the 1980s and 90s. More than 3 million aliens received amnesty through the Immigration Reform Act in 1986. But an economic recession in the early 90s is accompanied by a resurgence of anti-immigrant feeling. The policies put into effect by the Immigration Act of 1965 have greatly changed the face of the American population by the end of the 20th century. Whereas in the 1950s, more than half of all immigrants were Europeans and just 6% were Asian, by the 1990s, only 16% are European and 31% are Asians. And the percentages of Latino and African immigrants also jumped significantly. Between 1965 and 2000, the highest number of immigrants, 4.3 million, to the U.S. comes from Mexico. 1.4 million are from the Philippines. Korea, the Dominican Republic, India, Cuba, and Vietnam are also leading sources of immigrants, each sending between 700 and 800,000 over this period. Doctors check those passing through Ellis Island for more than 60 diseases and disabilities that might disqualify them from entering the United States. We don't check anybody for fucking diseases or disabilities anymore. They just fucking traipse right on through the fucking airport and out fucking security. Those suspected of being afflicted with having a disease or disability were marked with chalk and detained for closer examination. Listen, that sounds fucking reasonable. And I'm going to tell you a story at the end of this about when I owned a pest control company. It plays right into this. So in recent years, the unauthorized population has declined slightly after a continued growth for decades. In 2014, there were an estimated 11.1 million unauthorized immigrants residing in the United States. This population reached a high of 12.2 million in 2007-ish, but saw a gradual decline during the Great Recession. So here's my question. How do they know this? Do they mark and tag all the illegal aliens? Where do they get their fucking numbers? If they know the fucking numbers, then they know where these people are, and they can easily be found and deported, or processed, or what the fuck ever. I call bullshit on them knowing the numbers on illegal immigrants. There's no way you know 11.1 million fucking illegal immigrants have crossed the border. And again, if you do, then you've been lying to the American public about how you track that shit. Mexicans account for half of all unauthorized immigrants in the United States. Half. But the unauthorized Mexican population is declining, according to them. In 2014, 5.8 million unauthorized immigrants from Mexico resided in the United States, compared with 6.4 million in 2009 and 6.9 in 2007. Again, where are you getting your fucking numbers on illegal immigrants who don't talk to anybody? Unauthorized immigrants are increasingly entering the United States legally and overstaying visas rather than crossing the border. In 2014, 42% of unauthorized population, around 4.5 million individuals, were visa overstayers. Remember me telling you about the Brazilian chick that was, I dated there for a little bit? She was an overstayer. 2/3 of new unauthorized arrivals in 2014 entered the United States on legal non-immigrant visas and overstayed their visa's validity period. Visa overstays have exceeded unauthorized border crossings every year from 2017 through 2014. And over this period, a total of 600,000 more individuals overstayed visas than entered the United States by crossing the border. Again, think of this Brazilian chick, 6-month visa. She's been here 2 years. She ain't fucking going nowhere till somebody fucking puts her on a fucking plane. 6 states are home to the majority of the unauthorized population. 6. As of 2014, 21% of the nation's unauthorized population lived in California. Really? Texas? Wow. That was 21 and 15%. 8% in Florida, 7% in New York, and 5% in New Jersey, and 4% in Illinois, for weird reasons, I guess. Latinos and Asian Americans have overwhelmingly supported Democrats in the past 2 elections. So just listen to this. President Barack Obama was reelected in 2012 with the support of 71% of Latino voters and 73% of Asian American voters. Latino and Asian American voters largely supported former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton over President Donald Trump in the 2016 election. 79% of Latino voters supported Clinton, and 18% supported Trump. Asian Americans voted similarly, with 79% supporting Clinton and 17% supporting Trump. Listen, it's no wonder Democrats want these illegal immigrants to stay in the USA and to welcome more with arms wide open. The state of the border and interior enforcement of the U.S. Border Patrol staffing has increased dramatically over the past decade. In 2016, the Border Patrol employed 19,828 agents, 61% more than the 12,349 that were employed in 2006. Staffing along the southern border rose 54% from 11,000 individuals in 2006 to just over 17,000 in 2016. Surveillance technology is increasingly used to monitor the border. Since 2005, the Border Patrol has made an effort to deter unauthorized migration by increasing the consequences of unauthorized entry. Instead of permitting unauthorized entrants to be voluntarily returned to their countries of origin under the consequence delivery system, such immigrants are frequently issued formal removal orders that render them ineligible to re-enter the country for at least 5 years. Of course, they still sneak back anyways, don't they? And in some cases, they're barred permanently, and they may face criminal charges if they attempt to re-enter lawfully. Well, they're re-entering unlawfully, so that is a criminal charge. Why do we have to have extra fucking laws for that? The U.S. government spends more on immigration enforcement than all other federal criminal law enforcement agencies combined. From 1986 to 2012, the federal government allocated nearly $187 billion for immigration enforcement. In 2012, it spent almost $18 billion on immigration enforcement, 24% more than its combined spending for the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Secret Service, Marshal Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. E-Verify, an online system used to check a prospective employee's work authorization status, is currently used by more than 500,000 businesses in the United States. My business, I had to use it. But the program contains a significant flaw. Oh wow, I'm just now hearing about this. An audit found that the E-Verify system incorrectly identified 54% of unauthorized workers as lawful employees, mostly due to document fraud. Fucking lovely. Derek, you son of a bitch, are you illegal? I know he's not. So, many states are extending in-state tuition to unauthorized immigrants. What the fuck? Since 2001, at least 18 states have granted qualified unauthorized immigrants in-state tuition for college. At least 6 states also allow unauthorized students to receive financial aid. What the fuck? Really? Why? I repeat, why? They're illegal fucking immigrants and we're giving them financial aid to go to fucking college? California has pioneered laws promoting the integration of unauthorized immigrants. Between 2001 and 2015, California passed more than a dozen laws on immigrant integration. In June 2015, the state granted health care access to all unauthorized children and boosted spending on naturalization assistance. As of 2014, California professional licensing boards must consider applicants regardless of their immigration status. California also grants in-state tuition to unauthorized immigrants, and eligibility for driver's license does not depend on immigration status. Remember the legal alien Uber driver that was raping girls? Thank you, fucking California. In recent years, numerous states and localities have issued driver's license, municipal ID cards, or identification cards to unauthorized immigrants. Such identification documents, which are valid only at the state and local level, and they're not used, for federal use or whatever, they are permitted under the Real ID Act of 2005. As of June 2016, 12 states and the District of Columbia grant driver's license to unauthorized immigrants. Those 12 states need to have their fucking necks wrung. The people in those 12 states and the District of Columbia need to stand the fuck up and get that shit reversed. Again, I don't understand why we're giving driver's license to illegal fucking immigrants. Nationwide, more than 600 states, counties, and municipalities limit cooperation with federal immigration officials. At least 53 counties prohibit the use of local resources to assist ICE in federal immigration enforcement, and 25 counties instruct local law enforcement not to inquire into a person's immigration status, period. Many jurisdictions refrain from holding individuals in custody without probable cause based solely upon an ICE detainer request, and some limit ICE's ability to interrogate immigrants in their custody. The federal government is asking to talk to somebody, and you're not going to allow them? That's fucking treason. Fuck you, on top of all that bullshit. Listen, Latinos overwhelmingly oppose the construction of a border wall. We all know that. In October 2016 CBS poll, 76% of Latinos expressed opposition to a border wall. Oh, really? Well, seeing how 16% of their population is here, of course they don't want a fucking border wall. They want more family to fucking come on over. It's fucking ridiculous. Why today's immigration is a worse problem than the Great Wave, okay? Supporters of today's mass immigration like to claim that we should not be concerned about it because it's no worse than the Great Wave immigration at the turn of the last century. But in fact, because times have changed greatly in the last 100 years, immigration is now more out of sync with our country's needs than it was at the turn of the last century. Today, we need skilled workers. In the economy of the Gilded Age, that was when the rapid industrial expansion was taking place, low-skilled workers were highly employable. New mechanical devices and processes were being introduced that did away with the need for workers with special industrial skills and know-how. As the U.S. Industrial Commission pointed out, the fact that machinery and the division of labor opens a place for the unskilled immigrant makes it possible not only to get the advantages of machinery, but also to get the advantages of cheap labor. However, modern technology requires skilled workers, not unskilled ones. In 2001, only 16% of legal immigrants were admitted as skilled workers. Today's immigrants are permanent and create net cost. Before 1900, there may have been some marginal fiscal gains from immigration. Today, the estimated annual net cost of each immigrant on average is $2,700. Then, immigrant stay in the U.S. was often temporary. Today's immigrants are here to fucking stay. The Immigration and Naturalization Service estimates that the rate of return from 1900 to 1904 was over 37%. In the 1990s, the rate of immigrants returning to their homelands was a much lower 15%. Today, assimilation is held back. Ethnic ghettoization and its retardation of assimilation is more serious now than 100 years ago. At that time, only rarely did a single ethnic group dominate an area of several city blocks. And even then, many immigrants moved out of such areas. Now, ethnic enclaves are huge and growing. In the city of Miami, for example, nearly half the population speaks English poorly or not at all. That's 50%. And 73% speak a language other than English when they're at home. What? 73% don't even speak English when they're at their house relaxing. Today, our country is no longer empty. During those frontier days, we had a vast, empty country, and states actively recruited immigrants. Hey, come here. We need people to help build cities and so forth and so on. Now our country is increasingly congested, and communities pass ordinances to limit the growth of their populations. In 1900, the number of people per square mile in the United States was 25.6. In 2002, it was 82 people per square mile, a more than 3 times greater population density. Today, we also have chain migration. At the turn of the last century, having relatives in the United States made it logistically easier to, move here. It did not, however, guarantee that you would be admitted. At the turn of this century, having near relatives in the United States makes you legally eligible to immigrate and guarantees you eventual admission. In 2001, 64% of legal immigrants were admitted simply because they had a relative here. Wasn't based on skills, wasn't based on knowledge, wasn't based on anything they could bring to society. It's because their fucking aunt lived here. Due to the eligibility of the foreign relatives of immigrants, there is a line of several million aliens waiting and eligible for admission as immigrants into the United States. We got people waiting in fucking line, again, because their auntie fucking is here. That's no reason to let them in. Obviously, there are many facets to immigration in the U.S., but what is clear and undeniable, we need a system that catalogs each migrant and background checks them and insists they learn English and assimilate and become productive citizens if they ever want to get a citizenship. No more just walking across the border or flying in on an airplane and walking out of airport free as a jaybird. So listen, earlier I talked about how I owned a pest control company. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the United States didn't have a bed bug problem, okay? We had eradicated bed bug problems back when we had DDT. DDT got outlawed. We still didn't have bed bug problems. But what's happened is now we allow people to come from third world countries. We don't quarantine them. We don't check them. We don't make sure they're healthy and all this type of stuff. They just get on a fucking plane with their suitcase and their backpack. They come from, fucking wherever, Jordan, Syria, wherever the fuck they happen to come from, fly on a plane over here, get off, and go fucking check in at a hotel and go about their fucking business, right? We got people who are coming from south of the border, Venezuela, Brazil, Nicaragua, Mexico, and they come on up. Guess what? All these countries had issues with bed bugs. Okay? You got the United States here. We had no fucking issues. Canada had no fucking issues. All these other countries, these third world type countries, they had bed bug issues. Their people came here to the United States. Guess what? Bed bugs have blown the fuck up. Nobody wants to talk about this shit, okay? But it's the fucking truth. And I'll give you examples how I know it's the fucking truth. Apartment complex. The apartment building had like 16 units in it. Everybody starts complaining of bed bugs. So we start inspecting all the units. Every single unit has some, but not a shit ton. Then we get to this one unit. This unit is ground fucking zero. There's got to be 10 million fucking bed bugs in this place. There are everywhere. On the fucking ceilings, the walls, fucking everywhere. Guess what? Very nice guy. He's from Pakistan. He lives there. You know what he tells us? Well, where I come from, these are just like ants or roaches or whatever. We don't really get bothered by them. So he's never reported it. And to him, it's no big fucking deal. Here's where it gets even crazier. Again, nice Pakistani guy. He's here on a visa, going to school. This was a hospital school up in Kansas City, Missouri. I won't say who they were. He has all these lab coats hanging up in his closet. You go and lift up the collars of his lab coat, and bed bugs are lined underneath the collars. You look in the pockets of the lab coat, pockets are lined with bed bugs. I asked him, do you take these lab coats to the hospital to do your internship and your learning? He says, yes. What happens is he takes his backpack and all of his shit. He gets there, opens up the lockers, puts his shit in there, puts his lab coat on, and he goes and does his shit. He is now contaminating that whole locker room. So anybody that's in the locker room with him is going to get fucking bed bugs and take them home and not know where the hell they came from. Anybody he goes and works on as a patient, he has a potential to give them bed bugs because he's got them on his fucking lab coat, okay? And again, to him, it was no big deal. So he never reported it. He didn't think it was an issue, but it is a fucking issue, okay? Another one, apartment complex. Nothing but illegals live in this apartment complex. One illegal rents the unit. Then they don't have any furniture in there. They lay cots and mattresses throughout the whole fucking unit of all these apartments. And what happens is you have people who are coming up from Venezuela and Nicaragua and everywhere else to Mexico and Central America, and they get to the United States. Then once they get in the United States, they all fucking start splintering off like fucking, roaches and shit. They get to this apartment complex, which is basically a way station for illegals. And they stay there for sometimes just a couple nights or sometimes a couple months. They get some jobs, earn some money, and then they fucking move on. The place is infested with bed bugs because these people are bringing them fucking in. And now the whole apartment complex is fucking infested. So listen, we need to fucking have people that come here be inspected. Be inspected for bugs, diseases, mental instability. And we need to quarantine them, treat them, or send them fucking back if they can't fucking pass those requirements. But we can't just let fuckers come into the country. You notice I didn't even talk about terrorism or any of this other shit. I'm just talking about from a fucking health safety standpoint. Okay? Terrorism and crime, that's a whole nother fucking subject of why we can't let people just come traipsing in. So Matt Damon, fuck you. Enjoy Australia. Hopefully I'll get to Australia soon myself. And if I see you there, I'll have a beer with you and laugh about what a fucking idiot you are. Again, thanks again, guys, for checking in on the podcast here. Episode 19. Didn't mean to get into all the crazy statistics and stuff, but after that Matt Damon article, I thought I'd do a little research on it and share some of that stuff with you. Again, check out www.cuttheshitalready.com. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast, links to the videos, and all the other good stuff. You can find us on YouTube as well, Cut the Shit Podcast. And as Ron Burgundy always says, stay classy, and until next time, friends.